This is Duke University.
Welcome. What a great party we had last night, class of 67. I'm Jerry Wilkinson, and pleased and honored to moderate this wonderful panel. I think today, as we as a panel discussed the goals of this Seeds of Change discussion, we really want to make it interactive. We'd like to have you be part and engage in the conversation. And I think, therefore, we're really going to leave a lot of times for questions that you may have. We do have time constraints. I think we've got a president's address at 11, and we need to be through at 10:30. So with that, we'll pay attention to the time. When we arrived here in September of 1963, John F. Kennedy was president. It was a time of Camelot. When we arrived in 1963, there was a minor skirmish or war going on in Southeast Asia, a place called Vietnam. But none of us believed that would impact us. When we arrived here in in September of 63, there was a young preacher minister out of Atlanta who was preaching and teaching nonviolence based on the teachings of Gandhi and Jesus. None of us had a clue as to what impact he would have on our lives. Just 4 years later, our class, by the way, which started out at 868, 759 of us graduated. And we all recall vividly, I think, the bomb scare that emptied the stadium. And the world had clearly changed. On November 22nd, our freshman year, John F. Kennedy had been assassinated, and the world stood still, and the world was changing. That skirmish, that war in Vietnam, that was a minor factor, had grown to 485,000 troops on the ground. It was growing to 600,000. The world was changing. Our country was split down the middle. That civil rights movement that was taking shape and moving forcefully by Martin Luther King Jr. was sweeping across the country. And little did we realize, those of us who were fortunate enough to be there when he was here in November 13th of 1965, that less than 3 years from that date, almost 2.5 years, he would be assassinated, a man who won the Nobel Peace Prize. So clearly things were changing. He was assassinated as he was organizing sanitation workers in Memphis. 1963 is when Duke broke the color line. And it's a celebration that we begin and think about and reflect on today in the Seeds of Change. But it's a celebration that Duke University, I think, is going to recognize in the next year, the 50th anniversary of breaking the color line. So our class that entered in 1963, and those of us who came back after we graduated in late 67, early 68, saw a different world, a world that we can see by the newspaper clippings from the Chronicle, a world where the president's house had been set in, Allen had been occupied, and frankly, drugs was much more prevalent. So change, as Bob Dylan was saying, times they were changing. Today, our class, Duke was changing, and we'll talk about that, going from what many would think would be a very good regional university to become what it is today, a national, global powerhouse. The individuals, and we'll talk about that today, who came here and changed, and they changed. Our class, for those who remember, was one that was the Time magazine referred to as we would be tossing pearls before the swine, and we were the swine. Our professors were teaching things that we couldn't fully appreciate. With that said, I want to do a very brief introduction, very brief. There's so many highlights, and one of the biggest tasks that I've had is to take in just a few bullet points our distinguished panel, but I'm going to attempt to introduce each of them, and then we're going to start with each of them talking about their change personally and their experience here at Duke. First, I'd like to introduce Wilhelmina Reuben Cook, one of the five first African Americans to come to Duke, class of 67. Went on to be a Woodrow Wilson Scholar at Harvard, law degree from University of Michigan, Phi Beta Kappa, May Queen. Wilhelmina is the daughter of academics. Her dad, her father, was president of Morse College of Sumter, South Carolina. Her mother was a professor and eventually dean of academic affairs. Wilhelmina has taught and worked in administrative roles at Syracuse, Georgetown, University of the District of Columbia. She is, and broke the color barrier in this, trustee emerita at Duke University, currently serves on the board of the endowment, and was recognized as a Distinguished Alumni Award. Second person I'd like to introduce is Nathaniel, Nate, or sometimes referred to as Buddy White, for those who know him well. Class of 67, Durham native, Hillside High School graduate, math major, BS in mathematics, did postgraduate work at UNC Chapel Hill, George Washington, very varied career in teaching and working. He's taught at Howard, University of District Columbia, North Carolina Central, Morehouse. He spent from 94 to 2006 as director of sponsored research at Morehouse. From 82 to 90, he was president of the Hayti Development Corporation, a group here in Atlanta that was involved in redevelopment. Served on many boards. He told me one of the things he's most proud of, he's an author of a book called Statistics from Scratch. So thank you, Nate. Dr. Paula Berger, 67, political science BA, master's, PhD from Johns Hopkins in political science. 1970, she was dean, began her administrative career as Dean of Women of Duke's Women's College, one of the youngest to do that. Various teaching capacities in administrative at Duke and Johns Hopkins. Retired 2010 from Johns Hopkins, Vice Provost, Dean of Undergraduate Education. Has her own consulting business. In 1989, she was awarded the Duke Merit of Honor. Also trustee, our class is blessed to have 3 trustees, Jack Bovender being a current trustee who's in the audience. Paula is celebrating her reunion with her daughter, who's class of 2007. How special can that be? Ask her which party she went to last night. I think she went to them all. Dr. Jan Palpadick, 1967, BA in history, master's and PhD from Brandeis. Her passion, her love is poverty, hunger, and the food advancement, food assistance in the United States. Author of many books, too many to list. Recipient this year of an outstanding award for the 2011 James Beard Foundation Leadership Award. Professor of sociology for 35 years at Hunter College. Last panelist is Al Kyle, fellow EE, BS in electrical engineering for 67. Al chose to go in the Marine Corps and graduate and served as a captain from 67 to 71 in Vietnam and an artillery commander in DMZ and Laos. After his military career in Vietnam, went to Harvard for an MBA. Subsequently went back to Harvard. I guess this was a midlife crisis to get an MPA, Master's in Public Administration from the School of Government. 25 years, distinguished career, Hewlett-Packard, medical devices, last 13 years, serial entrepreneur, and is working even now with some interesting things for cardiac surgery called the Echo Box. Albus had 2 children, a son and a daughter, here Chris in 98 and Elizabeth in 2000. With that said, as a background, I think we'll start the conversation, and it should be a conversation with Wilhelmina talking about Duke, change and changing her and her perspective from her experience here at Duke. Later.
Well, I'll start just by saying that Jerry asked us to reflect on our time here at Duke and how it changed us, and to do it briefly, so I'll try to do that. And as I thought about it, I think my experience at Duke was one that really allowed and challenged me to grow personally and to mature in a way I don't think I would have done in any other setting, in any other situation. And there were a couple of things that stand out. One is that Duke taught me about the potential for change given the right opportunities and possibilities and exposure. And I thought of one incident. Well, let me try it this way. When I first came to Duke, I asked to be in a double room for a number of reasons. One, when I went to college, I always assumed I would have a roommate. Also, it was cheaper. You might recall the differential pricing, and my parents had 6 of us at that time. And when I came, I had a single room. And I felt, my goodness, I'm going to have to pay because of other people's issues with rooming with a black person. And so after the first year, one of the young women in my FAC group and I became roommates, and we roomed for the next 3 years. But my senior year, as a result of being May Queen, I was asked to go to the Azalea Festival in Wilmington. And I remember coming back and walking across the campus was Dean Mary Grace Wilson, who was just wonderful, wonderful dean. And she said, Mimi, she said, how did it go? And I could tell she wanted to know what the reception was and so forth. And I talked to her, and I said, yes. She said, in rooming, I mentioned that I had a single room. All of the other young women had roommates, and I could see her face tighten. She was furious. I mean, she was checking it out, and I kind of smiled. I said, this is the change in 4 years. In the beginning, I could be in a single room, and it wasn't an issue. And by the 4th year, the idea that anyone would discriminate against me or make any judgment because of my race was just anathema to her. And she kind of, if you knew how she walked, she kind of turned and went back. And I don't know who got it in Wilmington, but I'm sure someone did. The other thing is I learned that it's important to stand up for what you believe, and that what you remember most are regrets. And so I think of times when I was silent or when I should have said something and didn't, and they still haunt me. I also learned that you can't say and talk about everything. You have to have good judgment. And the key is the honesty in how you approach situations. And so now sometimes I'll come home and I'll say, X happened, and I said this, and my children will say, why is it you, it's always you who stands up and puts yourself in these positions? And it's because it's easier, I've learned, to do that than to regret it later. I think Duke also taught me about a lot about myself. One, empathy. We all came to Duke. We were bright. We were smart. We did well in school, and I assume that. And that happened for me most of the time, except in Peter Cloffer's, I think it was, biology class. Fortunately, I did not want to be a doctor. I was not interested in pre-med. If I had, my hopes would have been dashed. And for the first time in my life, I understood what it was like to study very hard, to do your best, and not get, not even an A or a B. And I learned later that I have this difficulty, and so when I told the TA that I could not see anything in the microscope, I really couldn't, I have a blind spot. But that has helped me in my life to understand that you can do your best, and it doesn't mean you're not smart. It doesn't mean you're not worthy. You haven't changed. And so for me as a teacher, that has been an important lesson to learn. And then I learned to appreciate my parents and the good advice they gave me, and the principals, and how special they were, and how immensely privileged I was to have them as parents. And then finally, I learned that I can survive and thrive maybe in any situation, because if you look for them, they're always kindred spirits. There are people there who can be supportive, that you can support, and who can make a difference. And then finally, I think Duke keeps me from giving up on the idea of a racially just society and one without white privilege. And it's because of the friendships I made here at Duke that are enduring, because of the people I met, because of the change I saw, because of the change I saw in myself. And so for the opportunities I had for growth and for participation in the community, and that continue to sustain me, I'm most grateful.
Can you hear me? Fabulous. Um, Duke was for me, an intervention on the plan I had had for many years. My plan was to follow my father to Hampton Institute at that time, now Hampton University. And he was a class of 1937 graduate. And I thought I was going to be a Hampton pirate almost from the beginning. And the only thing that we really had in common coming to Duke in that sense was that the colors were exactly the same. And but what I found, my family had a family reunion at the March on Washington, August 28th, 1963. We had a New York wing, a DC wing, and a North Carolina wing, and we all converged to the March on Washington, the famous I Have a Dream speech. And that was just about 1 week prior to me coming to Duke. And so I had sort of a sense of the other thing is that our classmate who's not here with us, Mary Mitchell Harris, and I had been attached to the hip from grade 1 at Burton Elementary School all the way through Duke. And what that meant was it was a sort of a partnership in silence, because it's not that we ever really talked about it. Many of the people who knew me as Buddy, I'm a junior. You didn't want to be Nat Jr., and my mother enjoyed a singer who was not Buddy Holly, but was Buddy somebody. I'm supposed to look it up before today, but I forgot. So I had been Buddy since forever, but Mary had always called me Nathaniel. And called me that until, the last time I saw her, that's what she was speaking of me as. But at Duke, what happened is I remained Buddy White in large part. I did find that the one thing that they did, was from Durham, so the transition to Duke was to a whole different town that I did not know. And I had grown up in the southeast area of Durham. I'd gone to Hillside High. It was in those days, there weren't many opportunities for people with advanced degrees. There were lots of people with advanced degrees in our high school. We had a French teacher who taught at the Sorbonne, which caused me great trouble at Duke because I placed into third year French, which was conversational. And I'll never forget Professor Tuttle saying, "Monsieur Blanc, are you from the southern part of France?" and so as you moved into this process, I came with a definite point of view that was from an all-black area of people who expected me to go to college, as my father had. The motto was, "You can and you will." The how was left out, but that would work its way out. And so it was such a different environment. And certainly, I asked somebody the other day, did we have maids at the end of our time at Duke? And I think the answer was yes, that might have been maybe the last year or near the last year that they had. But certainly this was a different environment. And there were some experiences that changed me. I was telling this story. I had been a math major since the 4th grade. Catherine Pratt said, "You should be a math major." And somehow that stuck. I always thought I was going to be a math major. And it's interesting how these ideas that are inculcated early sort of direct you to that path. But little did I know that was not going to be the major lesson that I got from this experience. I do want to talk about the fact that the times were changing here, but not changing all that rapidly. They had made the accommodations. Gene and I, who's also in the class, the other African-American male in my class, and we were in the same dorm, York House. And they had prepared I would say fastidiously for us. We had upper class roommates. They didn't put us in a single, but they didn't put us in the same room either. And as G said, that was probably a reason for that. But I was often told the story, and there's folklore, and I bet you Bill Griffiths can tell us who it was. I had my best friend in high school was a fellow named George Creed. His brother Leon Creed was 1 year older, was very much interested in math. His mother worked in the registrar's office at NCC, and he wanted to go to Duke. And the reason he could not go is that they were not admitting black students in '62. And it is said that some trustee died that transitioned the vote from nay to yay between '62 and '63. So people would ask me, aren't you proud to be in the first class that had black students at Duke? And I'd say, well, somewhat. But I'd like to put it in context that it took a certain white trustee dying to get me to that place, and I'm not sure that's the significance. And then I would say, and you know, I became aware that W.B. Du Bois got a PhD from Harvard in 1895. And I rather thought, I'm not so sure this is significant as we might want to place it, even though it has its context. So I learned also, my best friend was George Creed. He was born, and I don't even know what his birthday is, except that it's either April 5th or April 7th. And the reason I don't know is because my best friend at Duke was an EE major, Kent Birmingham, who did have a single the first year, and we have remained friends. We lost contact for a while, but we became friends, and we are the most unlikely friends to have come from the paths we came. His family, first of all, he was raised Mormon in Utah, although his family was a Air Force family. His father was he was a pilot, but moved to intelligence. The link between him and George Creed was one was born April 5th, one was born April 7th, and I don't know which one is which. I have to, remember, I keep in touch with both of them. They were both in my wedding, and I have been friends with them all, and it was kind of like Kent became George in a strange sense. George's father was in the Air Force, was a Tuskegee Airman. And so they had these links of personality. So the other thing that happened, and somebody's going to have to make sure I don't go over 5 minutes, but the thing that made our experience interesting is that all through college, Kent and I, as we worked through things, and one of the things that he participated in, not really being an advocate thereof, I was not a great fan of Dixie, which was one of the hallmarks of the basketball and football games when we arrived. And I sort of resented, I wish I was in the land of cotton old times there and ne'er forgotten, and would not stand or applaud. And that the group of us that began to not stand enlarged over time to a point that, and I can't quite remember whether it was our sophomore year or our junior year, that they ceased doing it at Duke. And but my roommate was a partner in that process, and we don't know if he was. He wasn't a damn Yankee, but he was. He had been all around. He had lived in Turkey before he came, and he was more worldly. He also, you might recall that when we graduated, we had the proverbial bomb scare that is based on Wilhelmina's good looks in the newspaper. The day before, they featured Mary, Wilhelmina, and I standing in front of the wall on East Campus in the Durham Morning Herald, suggesting we were the first African Americans. So that bomb scare produced the transition of our graduation from Duke Indoor Stadium to the chapel. And I always joke about not all of the people made the transition. But, so I think that my lesson and what I learned is kind of reflected in the fact that Kent and I are still friends, and that we both talked about going to the Peace Corps after college. And so I went right to graduate school. He went to the Peace Corps in Afghanistan. Time to stop? Oh, so we'll stop at a moment. So the last part is that upon him coming back to D.C., we reconnected then. He taught math at a all-black high school in Washington. And his transition, as my transition, has been interesting. Now he's a patent attorney back in Utah, very progressive. I only say that in that he doesn't support Romney. But I just think that, and hopefully the questions will allow us to talk more about our times, but I'm going to stop now.
So I think the simple answer to the question of how Duke changed me is that my horizons were broadened to an extent much greater than I ever could have imagined by coming to Duke. I was first generation college from a very modest family. It was financial aid that allowed me to come to Duke. And so I didn't know what to expect in college because I had no family tradition that I was following and no context for my experience. But may strike some of you as funny given the understanding that we have now of diversity being racial and ethnic, but I was overwhelmed by the diversity of students I found at Duke. I got to know some rich people. I met someone from Florida who had never seen snow before. I had a suite mate one year who was from New York City, which she always referred to as the city, and she'd actually been to the opera. I knew someone whose father was a federal judge. I knew fellow students who wanted to be lawyers themselves rather than kindergarten teachers. So for all of these things, I was exposed to a range of possibilities for myself that I think, without coming to Duke, I wouldn't have imagined. And the nature of my intellectual awakening wasn't particularly academic, I think, but I did come to see from the experiences I had here and the people I knew the power of ideas at work. And clearly that was happening around us, but I also watched fellow students being energized by their own sense of wanting to speak out against things that they just simply thought were wrong. My own energies got devoted probably more differentially to campus organizations and campus politics rather than the external environment. But I found myself questioning my political beliefs and challenging assumptions that I had never thought to question. I asked myself, why wasn't I overwhelmed by all of this? We look at young people now who seem just struggling with making the transition to college, and I think, golly, this was just such a new world for me and my family. And I think one of the things that I attributed the comfort level I had with facing these challenges and this kind of personal growth was really the strength of the residential system on East Campus. And the idea that we had a sense of community, that our dorms were our homes, that there were a group of people who cared about us, people who were different from ourselves, that surrounded us with interest and concern, and that we had upperclassmen as mentors. And all of us who are that era remember the importance of FACs, people we could look up to who could help us navigate through the transition to college. So I came away from Duke with a much healthier level of self-confidence and a sense of ambition, and I don't mean naked ambition, but a sense of ambition to capitalize on possibilities that were before me that I think I otherwise wouldn't have had I not had that experience. And in addition to this sort of sense of wider possibility, I also became, therefore, firmly convinced of the power of education to unleash those possibilities for people, and I think that's one of the reasons why I went into higher education as a career, because I saw in my own life how life-changing and affirming educational opportunity could be. So that is my 2 minutes on how Duke changed me.
Okay. It's been a great deal of fun to think back. Really stirred up a lot of memories and a lot of thoughts. But I think I have to start by saying, if you want to think about the 60s, you have to remember the 50s. You have to remember where we came from. Now, this is partly because I was a history major, and that's part of what I learned here. But I think people who look back on the 60s as an era of turmoil and protest, what have you, may not remember just how rigid and complicated our social norms were in the late 50s and the very early 60s. They were kind of like our hairstyles, okay? They were hard to maintain, complicated. We sprayed them to make them rigid and big. And they were brittle because they were past their stage. And I think for me, encountering, and it did start for me with civil rights. I too was at the March on Washington a week before coming to Durham. But for me, there was a profound personal liberation that was deeply intertwined with the kind of social liberation and the liberation movements. The way I remember it is I wasn't so popular in high school. I mean, I didn't fit in is how I felt. Now, I've since learned that almost everybody felt that way in high school. But I really thought it was me. I was too tall, and I was too serious, and I was a little moralistic, and, possibly I was too smart for a girl. But anyway, I definitely didn't feel like I fit in. And I got to Duke, and I felt at home. I felt comfortable. The other women in my FAC group were, smart and opinion. And then I was in Giles House, and there was a note on the chalkboard that if you wanted to participate, if you wanted a ride to the civil rights demonstrations in Chapel Hill, to show up at the Methodist Student Center at 6 p.m. or what have you. And for me, I felt like, well, there goes my popularity. There goes my comfort level with my peers, because I'm going. And I didn't think you were all coming. But in fact, very quickly, it became quite okay on campus to be outspoken in favor of civil rights, and then a whole series of other causes. We worked very hard around the issue of labor rights for the non-academic employees. Rumor was that the maids on the West Campus made your beds. I just want you to know that on the East Campus, we were supposed to make our own beds, but we heard that you... Well, they would have needed every penny because they were getting 80 cents an hour. And that is math, I'm sort of enumerate, but that's one number I remember. So, I guess I want to say that I think for many students who were here at that time, this interrelated process of personal liberation, of figuring out what was important to us. Do you remember the Judy Collins song, "It Isn't Nice to Block the Doorways"? A song that really addressed the fact that the tactics of movements violated our upbringing. I was raised to be a young lady. And one other memory that fits into this for me, Wilhelmina mentioned an appreciation for her parents. That saying, you remember that the university was in loco parentis. And so one response to students beginning to participate in those civil rights demonstrations over in Chapel Hill was that we had to get a permission letter from our parents if we thought we might be out of the dorm overnight, right, subsequent to being arrested. And my father wrote such a letter, and maybe of all the things my father ever wrote on my behalf, it's the one I treasure most. He wrote it to Mary Grace Wilson, saying, yes, that my parents fully supported my involvement and that they thought that it was part of what higher education was all about, and an expression of our, at that point, Christian values. But I guess I've carried this forward with me into my life because I have taught undergraduates mostly for the last 35 years. So I watch students go through periods of change and turmoil, and there is that interaction of the personal and the broader. I don't think I've seen students have the kind of exhilarating experience that I think we had, because we could see the change. Just you could see it in Mary Grace Wilson's change, but we could see barriers falling. We could see change happening. It was a little bit of a bubble. I think I've spent a fair amount of my subsequent life yearning for the sort of moral certainty I felt. I mean, I knew we were on the right side. And maybe that's why I work on hunger as an issue, because, it has a little bit of that resonance, and I'm sure I'm right. But I am very grateful not only to the university for the incredible opportunities they made available, but to all of my classmates, those with whom I agreed and those with whom I didn't agree, for the we took each other seriously. It mattered to me what other people thought, and it mattered to them what I thought, and I think that's what I've carried forward in life.
I reported for duty in Vietnam to the 2nd Battalion, 12th Marines in June 1968. Over the previous year, our unit had been in a lot of hard service in northern I Corps, that's up by the DMZ, during the Tet Offensive, locations of the Rock Pile, Khe Sanh, Con Thien. And the battalion that I joined included an array of outstanding Marine officers. One Medal of Honor winner, future National Security Advisor for the United States. And in my first meeting with the battalion commander, he informed me that Captain Norton, who I was replacing, was rotating back to the U.S. to enter Harvard Law School. He was an outstanding officer, and frankly, the colonel felt sorry for me because the only place the communication platoon was going was down. Welcome to Vietnam, the Second Lieutenant Kyle, So in the next 13 months, our unit achieved a remarkable string of successes, including the defeat of the 320th North Vietnamese Division in fighting along the DMZ, and an operation in the A Shau Valley on the Laotian border. We captured an incredible array of weapons and material and prevented the Tet Offensive that year in our section of Vietnam, the only year that there was no Tet Offensive as a result. But that was in 1969, and frankly, nobody cared back in the U.S. The nation had moved on, and the anti-war sentiment was such that it didn't really matter to many people, I think, what happened there. So I returned to Vietnam last year, appropriately, with a Duke alumni tour. And the group from Duke had 4 veterans in the group. A medical doctor, a sniper who was part of the Operation Phoenix. Many of you remember that was a CIA-led assassination team, a series of teams. A machine gunner, and me. And not surprisingly, the tour didn't take us to Khe Sanh, and Con Thien and those places. But for me, it was a good chance to reflect on things I hadn't thought about at all in more than 40 years, in reading and thinking. And I thought I'd share 2 facts that might interest you all. The first one is that after defeating the United States, North Vietnam was invaded by China. And a Chinese friend of mine actually served in the Chinese army in Vietnam. And he claimed that the Chinese withdrew, they did, after invading North Vietnam, after suffering more than 50,000 casualties in Vietnam. Wikipedia, I think, estimates only 26,000, but in any case, the North Vietnamese army, after defeating the French, of course, the United States, invading Cambodia, had the Chinese army invading them and fought them back. The second, during the time in Vietnam, I learned that the man who was the Time magazine bureau chief then, in the 60s, was outed as a North Vietnamese spy. And over the 10 years, which comprised mostly our experience, he wrote 500 reports that were carried by courier to Hanoi and were read by Ho Chi Minh. And he was privy to a lot of inside information because the military was using the press, or trying to influence public opinion, and they were given a lot of inside information. And this individual helped to plan the Tet Offensive personally with a North Vietnamese intelligence agent. A lot of surprises and bad ones, I think, about what happened during those years. So finally, I do want to remember one of our classmates, DJ Barrett, and I don't know how many people on the panel would remember this guy. I know Jerry remembered DJ, and he was one of the members of our class who died in Vietnam. I knew Jim in Boy Scouts and high school here at Duke, and he was a phenomenal athlete, 2-letter man, in a time when we had excellent football teams, professional players, and Jim was one of the best. He lived life large, if those of you who knew him. I sent his photo to Randy, and Randy Garcia from the Alumni office is a veteran of the Iraq War. And he saw the picture of Jim getting commissioned in front of the Iwo Jima statue with his father, who was a Marine officer as well, and responded that it was so sad. And I think, unfortunately, I think that's a fair summary of the whole Vietnam experience. That it was so sad, and there were 58,000 people like D.J. Barrett that lost their lives doing that.
Thank you. I think you see the depth and breadth and the quality of our wonderful panel. One more generic question, and then we're going to try to open it up. And that is, each of you would kind of reflect the future role of change, seeds of change, both what you would see from maybe a couple of trustees' point of view, what Duke can do and does do, from Paula and Wilhelmina, and individually where you see what role individually we should play, and how the role of change may evolve with technology, with the world that we live in, that we've experienced, and just address that broad subject in a way that you would feel comfortable, and then we'll talk about a couple of specific issues and then open it up. Wilhelmina, you want to start?
I'm going to defer to Paul.
Okay, defer to Paula.
You know,
She's on the board.
She is.
No, I was thinking about the fact that when I was an undergraduate at Duke, lots of the social activism and the students who were most engaged really worked through the YWCA on the East Campus and the YMCA on West. That's what I remember being the organization that sort of led social activism. And I think one of the very healthy things that's happened at Duke in the last number of years is the degree of civic engagement that students feel. It's not limited just to working through the why, but lots of folks have figured out how to put knowledge to work in service of society, and this is one of the things that the current administration is very eager to encourage. And there's a program some of you may have heard called Duke Engage, by which students after their most of them after their freshman or sophomore year are given grants to go somewhere around the world or here locally and do a project that allows them to tackle a problem of social or economic or health significance that they're energized about. And I think that these kinds of experiences now are much more the norm for students rather than just the Jan Poppendicks of the world who are active in the Y. We've got, lots of folks committed to seeking a way to make a difference. And I think it's influencing how, as they graduate, they see themselves living a life of consequence. And so it seems to me that that's a very, very healthy development here. The other thing, I was thinking about the fact that when we were undergraduates, no one studied abroad. Do you remember anyone who left the campus?
One person.
I think there was one person who maybe went to France, and I'm sure that was by special exception and all of that. And now the fact that half the students here spend a semester experiencing another culture deeply, one hopes. I'm sure they experience lots of other things. But that's a tremendous opportunity to think of yourself as a global citizen and to start those seeds being sown now. So those are two ways in which I think the university is trying to broaden horizons for our current generation of students.
Could I say one thing that is connected to this is that there's been, when we were in school, it was said that Duke was moving toward from its regional status to a national status, and that one of the best ways to get into Duke was to apply from somewhere where nobody else had applied from. And we had this joke in our dorm that one of our classmates came from near Spokane, Washington, and that had to be the only reason he could have gotten in. But one of the things that I think is important as we think about how Duke reflects the world is that the importance of diversity, not so much for what it might do to our touchy-feely, but the fact that if we're going to be of and about the world, We have to experience that as early as possible. So the diversity that's enhanced here will assist us in making connections outside that can make us much more functional in a society that's much different from where we individually come from. And as we move to a world, it always shocks me when they talk about the middle class of China is the size of the entire United States. And so there are these forces that we shall have to deal with that if we experience them early on in terms of our interactions, we'll have a far better chance of making this a successful venture.
I'll second the Duke Engage idea. My profession now is startups, technology startups. And this startup program that Duke runs, I think is pretty good. Is it the Challenge? I think the Startup Challenge.
Right.
And frankly, the Northeast has been slow. My alma mater, Harvard, just slow as molasses. Duke's out in front of that. So it's social engagement, and that's good, and I encourage that. But also for people that want to try their hand at starting companies and so forth. And I think it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The university can position itself against other elite schools as being more proactive. I think they do. And then I think the students tend to take that up and maybe participate more. So I think it's great, frankly, the positioning of the school. It's almost a marketing positioning, but I think it's a sincere and good thing to do.
So I'm going to chime in and say I'm ambivalent about the model. I love that students are being encouraged to use what they've learned and to use their enormous endowments and capacities to solve problems. And I love that the university sees the intellectual, educational potential of this. I actually remember writing a paper for that honors master's program about the university's resistance to the failure to harness the learning in voter registration projects and what have you. So I'm all for it, but I think it's too bad if we lose the model of collective action as well as the kind of individual and small team, because some problems in our society, I don't think there's an app you can invent that's going to fully address the mounting inequality in our society, and I think that's the issue that has become the kind of, now, I live in New York, so for me, Occupy Wall Street was, I could go there, I could interact with the young people. But I just want to tell a very quick story. Yesterday, my husband Woody and I took the Duke Forest tour, which if you haven't had a chance to do, I highly recommend, really neat. And in front of me on the bus was a guy saying, I was class of 77. We felt like we missed the collective action of the 60s. But then Duke decided it was going to close the forestry school and deaccession the forest, to sell off the forest. And we made that our cause, and we acted. Well, how wonderful is it? I mean, that may be a revisionist version of history, but how wonderful is it that Duke kept the forestry program? Because now, as we understand what's happening to our atmosphere, what could be more important than having a research forest? So it left me thinking, oh yeah, we should listen to the young when they speak up collectively.
Can I just follow up on something that Jan said that makes me think that another thing I think that's different now, and you refer to as collective action, but we had a lot of people pushing to change the system, but they were still trying to work to affect the system. And I worry about young people's sense of engagement with the political process. I think we're all jaded watching what's, I'll speak for myself. I'm jaded watching what's happening in Washington and disenchanted with it. But I do think that as much as people fought the system, it was to affect change within the system. And I don't feel as good about the channeling of those kinds of energies now. And I think we're a bit adrift. We've got people who've had careers in public life who are giving up on it because of the distastefulness of the tenor of that. And of course, the tenor of many of the discussions on campus and even internal conversations about social regulation, all it got a little bit aggressive at times, but people were still respectful of a system. They wanted to work better for themselves. And I worry about our cynicism now about the system.
Yeah, I think that we had core values, and part of the impetus for change was that we saw the gap between what we wanted to be our ideals and our values and where we were. And so we could move toward that, and we did so in a way that was respectful, that was civil, and that, I think that made a difference in the way we interacted with each other. And I'm not sure we have that sense any longer. At least we don't have, well, I'm not sure we have that sense, not that it is missing, but because we have not been able, through collective action, or maybe this is it. When you talk about technology and so forth, that so much of our lives have been targeted to kind of individual interactions, interactions with the technology. You know, this bowling alone concept, we don't come together in collectively in discussions, the data that shows if you watch television a lot, you're not going to be civically engaged, you're not going to be involved in social activities and organizations and so forth. And those are the things that kind of keep us connected, that make us aware of other people's lives and experiences, and keep us from being insulated in our own worlds. And we need to think of, you can't do some things virtually, I think.
Good point. Jan is, I'd like for her to address briefly, if she will, hunger and poverty in the United States and the change that has happened and the change that needs to happen and how you would see that maybe happen. Would you address that?
Sure, and I'll try and bring it back to my experience here at Duke. One of my big memories from it must have been my freshman year, was painting the bridge. Remember how we used to paint the bridge?
Oh, yes.
So John Kernodle and I painted the bridge to recruit volunteers for Operation Breakthrough. And I believed then, and I do now, and have through all my teaching, that engaging people, so it's like the Duke Engage, with people who've had different life experiences is productive of learning and productive of steps toward a better society. And the poverty issue when we were undergraduates was in a way submerged in the civil rights movement. I mean, I think many Americans became aware of poverty by listening to the leaders of the civil rights movement speak out about the kinds of conditions. I mentioned what non-academic employees were earning at Duke when we were here, but it was when they began to organize and assert their rights that we learned that. So poverty in the United States has declined since the sort of official discovery in the early 60s, but it fluctuates pretty dramatically with the condition of the economy. So although there's a lot of ideology in our culture that looks to individual responsibility, and there is no question but what individual choices affect one's likelihood of taking advantages of opportunities that are there, structurally, if there aren't enough opportunities to go around, we're going to have people who are poor. If the minimum wages are too low, we're going to have people who can't support their families. I think it's both a testimony to the persistence of advocates and the strengths in our safety net that 1 out of 7 Americans is now on the SNAP program, formerly known as food stamps, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. It's both a testimony to we have a program that works, it's counter-cyclical, it expands when the economy gets worse, and shocking. It's shocking that so many people in our society aren't able to meet the basic needs of their families on the basis of what they're able to earn. I'm sort of out of the the closet here as someone who's very sympathetic to the Occupy Wall Street movement, and I think that we've got to address poverty by paying some attention to what's happening at the top. That to the extent that we allow privileges and resources to become kind of sequestered at the top, there's less to go around for other people. It's true in housing, it's true in healthcare. So I think we've got to address these issues. I don't know how much more hunger in the United States is an outrage. I mean, we have plenty of food. On the other hand, it is something to which Americans have been consistently responsive. There are food drives all over the place. I actually wrote a book about this, and I'm not going to sell copies here, but to say that I think...
There is an autograph party.
But I do want to compliment the Duke reunion staff. Here comes Randy back into the room, to say that I went by the Gothic bookstore, and they have a whole window full of books by alumni, including my most recent book. But anyway, I just want to say that I think we need to use our intellectual prowess that Duke helped us strengthen to be careful about the seductions of hunger charities. Yes, put the can in the barrel, but don't stop there, because if you do, you're really allowing your energies to be drawn off into what's kind of a camouflage. We need to address the structural inequalities.
I'm going to open it up for questions, but first, I'd like to, Gene Kendall was part of the 5, and Gene, I didn't give him a heads up, but retired real admiral, fellow engineer, and has an interesting perspective and a career, having spent 2 years at Duke. Would you care to share any thoughts before we kind of open it up for questions about Duke and your perspective from when you were here, how it worked, and looking comparison with other institutions? Not as much as Nate. 2 or 3 minutes, whatever you would like. You want the mic? Here, you go. You want to sit down there?
No. We'll do the amen stuff, the whole thing. Okay. All right.
No collection, no.
Whatever. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Gene Kendall. One of the first 5 who came in '63. As a matter of fact, I was the first on campus. I looked and I saw. So, okay, I'll give you that. Okay, West Kansas. Okay, I'll give you that. But if we look back at that particular time, I was a wide-eyed, naive. I didn't come from even the same backgrounds as Wilhelmina, Mimi we called her then. I think I still call her that because that's what she was, that's her name, okay. And Buddy, because I had come from that traditional, absolutely segregated high school. And I didn't know what I didn't know. I was nowhere close to being prepared for the environment that I was going to go into in engineering. You know, I'm going to be a mechanical engineer. Had no idea what I was going to get into. And I was absolutely shocked my first physics exam. Remember, in my high school, I had never had anything less than an A+. 12 years of school, all the way through. And my first physics exam, I got a 17. And I've got it, it's framed, I've got it, you know, and whatever. And I said, you know, there's got to be a mistake, and I went, you know, whatever. And the professor said, yes, Mr. Kendall, there was a mistake, and the mistake was you being in this physics lab. Okay. And so I was trying to learn calculus in physics and physics in calculus, and that precisely put me in a do loop, and I'll stay to the 2 minutes, but I had to put that in context. But what Duke taught me as I grew those 2 years was the success or failure, however you decide to define those 2 events. They are not events, they're processes. And what I learned in that losing the scholarship and carrying the weight of an entire school and a city and so forth as a 19-year-old, that was heady stuff, okay? And I vowed that I would not resurface until I could hold my head up. And so I went off to the local recruiters to go fix things. And the Army, Air Force, all of the various agencies, and my goal was to go back to finish my degree. I owed that to my parents. And so the options were simple. You know, most of the guys offered Vietnam, which was not as thrilling as I thought that they thought. And so I opted for the United States Navy. And I grew quickly in that because I saw some institutional things. The Navy, probably the toughest of those things to change the traditions that we are beginning to see full circle. You know, I'm currently working on a study for some elements of the Navy to point out where we have gone in the 60s to where we are as things evolved. As you might expect, recent policies like Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal, the full opening of women in combat, lots of discussions people get into over that, and I'm sure that in this group we'll have those exact same things. But there are some truths in all of that. But what happened with me in that 35 years and going from the absolute bottom in the Navy to retiring as a Rear Admiral in 2000 was I never, ever forgot the beginnings of what happened to Duke. In fact, when the Navy decided to send me back to school, I was still foolish enough to say, when they asked me where I want to go back to school, I said Duke. And they said, yeah, right, sure, okay, okay. We're not going to send you to Duke. I mean, that's a little expensive, don't you think, Ken? So, well, yeah, I guess so, but you asked, you did ask. And then they said, well, you know, we understand that, so here are your options. We can send you to UNC or NC State. And see, there's you understand, you know exactly what my reaction was, and that's why I went to the University of Kansas. Okay. But the issues, though, at Kansas, all of those things were exactly the same. We were there, and Kansas, that hotbed of supposed conservatism, okay? I happened to be in the professor of military sciences office, and I don't want to really denigrate the Kansas engineering programs, but it was fireball. But the kids used a Coke bottle for the fireball. And so it just bounced off the walls and it charred it, you know, and we wanted to go out and show them, here's how you make a real Molotov. Okay. But the incidence was, the parallel was exactly the same. Exactly the same. The difference was the maturities that I had gained and an avenue of confidence that I had begun to go, and the decision to forgive myself for not being as prepared as I should have been to start with, and understanding that everything that happened to me was part of a plan, you know, and I had run from God for a long time. I'd come from a very religious family, but, you know, my issue was they could pray me through it. I didn't need the rest of that, And so I went off to do my other thing. But the first thing was the realization that you can't really separate yourself from your higher purpose and expect to go anywhere with it, because there were, we just don't have enough time to go through the parallels that I saw things changing, that all of us. Here's an example. I do one. Do I have a minute? When I'd come through high school, I remember writing in an old girlfriend's yearbook that I was going to teach physics at a small, exclusive Eastern university. And then I come, to Duke and flunk my first physics test. Okay. And so I thought, okay, that's probably not going to work. Okay. So I go off to the Navy, and at Kansas, I majored in engineering physics. And toward the end of my Navy career, I was sent to the United States Naval Academy as the first African-American non-Naval Academy graduate to be the director of the Division of Math and Science, essentially the Dean of Math and Science. And I was there, and we had to, I wasn't supposed to really teach, and because I was the guy to make the other 140 PhDs teach, because they could never get they could teach, but they could never get their assignments and papers graded on time, and so that was my job, was to get them to do that. According to the admiral, he said that, so it was my job. But I taught a course. They asked me to teach introductory physics course for a lecture for a semester, because there was something that was going on that just really tied up most of the senior faculty. And I finished that course, and I remember it very, very vividly that day. The next day, I received a set of orders transferring me from the Naval Academy. And as I was going to that next assignment, I looked back on that, and I said, my goodness, even though that was not supposed to be my destiny, the Lord put me in that position just to give me some hope, to let me say that if you do what I say, I will give you what you think that you need for a season, even if it's not my will. Naval Academy is a very exclusive school. It is very small. It is in the East. And it was, and I that just hit me on the plane, that, that experience was only because I submitted myself to the Lord's will. That's it. That's all I got. Okay. Thank you.
I think we got 15 minutes for questions, and many of you must be, feel free to ask individually, ask any question. That's really what we want to do. Questions? Yes?
Well, this is not a question, but I'm struck by the contrast between your experience and mine here. When I arrived here in 1948 from New England, and I'm sure the only reason I got in here is because I was from New England. Because Duke wanted people from New England and New York and the Mid-Atlantic States. And the water fountains on the Hilladale Golf Course were two different colors, and the whole culture was so totally different. And I look out here now, there was a big campaign about an election that happened yesterday here. I can't recall anybody in our class ever worrying about anything that went on in Durham, period. It was so different. And now to take that contrast and come back here today and see how different it is, not just from when I was here, but from when you were here, and from the people in the 90s, it blows me away. Thank you.
Other thoughts, questions? Yes, Hope.
Yeah, Jerry, as a follow-up to that, as you went through your admissions process and you saw the face of Duke changing, as we're becoming a global force, what is appropriate for us, and I'm not meaning to be nationalistic, but if you look at the face of Duke today, it doesn't even reflect this group. Where should we be going in terms of our future role in the world economy? And
No, that's a good question, and I'm going to ask the trustee emerita and the trustee, and then even if Jack Bobin would like to answer. The admissions here is out of sight. I went to School of Engineering yesterday, and to get in the School of Engineering, it's 20 to 1, 20 applications for one acceptance. There's 31,000 plus for a class of 1,600. I don't know. And that's a question that is changing, and how that decisions are made, and what the impact is in the future of Duke University and the role what it should be. I think we've got a fantastic board that struggles with that issue and addresses and balances a lot of very difficult things to balance. So with that said, Paula or Wilhelmina or Jack, would you? Jack, why don't you address that? Put you on the spot. I gave you more than Gene.
I'm going to ask Paul to correct everything I've said. The trustees are, in fact, wrestling with this very issue. I think the future of Duke, as the future of any university in this country that wants to be relevant 50 years from now, it's going to have a much more global outlook and be more involved globally. Many of you know that we are making an investment in Kunshan in China, just outside of Shanghai. Actually, the province of Kunshan is making the investment. They're doing all the capital. They bought the land. They're building the buildings. And Duke's commitment there is to develop essentially first a business school program there in Kunshan. And it will start with the Masters of Management Science degree, the one-year program that we're doing so successfully here at Fuqua now. But I'm sure it's only kind of the pioneering effort that we'll see later, the School of the Environment and many other parts of Duke. This is a grand experiment for us, and some people are doing it. I mean, some people are feeling among the trustees, although there's unanimous approval from the trustees, but in the university as a whole is this something we should be doing? Do we really understand what we're doing? There's the issues of academic freedom in a country where that's not the tradition that it is here, that we've got to work through, and we're being very careful about that. But the fact of the matter is it's the largest country in the world population-wise, and it's a growing part of our trade relationships and our economic relationships, and indeed in the future our cultural relationships. And I think one thing that universities like Duke should be, if they want to be relevant going forward, is we've got to be more entrepreneurial and experimental about the teaching model. So that's an important issue as we look at Duke as having a global presence. And I will tell you, putting Kunshan aside for a while, we're already a global presence. We have a presence in one way, shape, or form in many, many countries, not just through Duke Engage, but through teaching programs that Duke's involved with in many, many countries in the world. So I think that's very important. The second thing I think we've got to focus on is the cost of education, higher education in this country. And we've got to figure out some new teaching models to help control or at least bend the curve of that downward. You know, I've spent my whole career in healthcare, and I know and you know about how fast healthcare costs have gone up in this country on a yearly basis. But the cost of higher education has gone up at twice and 3 times and sometimes 4 times the rate of healthcare. And we've got to figure out ways to tackle that. And I think Duke has the intellectual capital to work through this, but we've got to have the will to do it because we just cannot sustain, not just Duke, but higher education in this country can't sustain the trajectory we're on as far as cost. So that's an issue that we, as trustees, are trying to deal with now. And I'd like to make one comment talk about global, but also about the impact of Duke and Durham over the last 10, 20 years. Duke has made major investments in Durham through direct investment in the warehouse projects, the old American Tobacco Company warehouse projects, leasing space, taking office space, and doing a lot of other direct involvement in Durham. And the Durham that we knew when we were here is long gone, and it's become one of the hot cities in the U.S. in a lot of magazine rankings about places to live, places to retire. Durham is number 1 or number 5 or whatever on the list. And I think we can all be proud as Duke alums that we have made that investment in this city, and that our students are as involved through Duke Engage and other programs in Durham. So, Paula, what did I get wrong?
No, nothing. The only thing I would add, just keying on Holt's question about admissions, is that, a dean of admissions at a prestigious institution once said that the goal in selecting a class is to put together a set of students that'll have the maximum educational impact on itself. And I really do believe that, and I think unless we have a diverse student body, we're suboptimizing the educational experience for the students. And when you think about what our country looks like now and what it's going to look like 10, 20, 30 years from now, it's not looking like the people in this room. And we've got really to prepare our students to be in a position to lead institutions and organizations to respond to the challenges we're going to have. And they're not going to be as well prepared to do that if they're not experiencing some of that now through their education. And Jack mentioned the cost side of this, but I think the support for students through financial aid as an institutional commitment is absolutely vital if we're going to have that kind of student body. And I applaud the fact that early in his tenure here, President Broadhead made a financial aid challenge, the primary fundraising campaign in those first years. And we've got to continue that if we're going to expect to be able to support the sorts of students who'll mirror the kind of country that we have.
Yes, ma'am. Judy. So yeah, I think your question's about the broader education system, and your point, can Duke students get into,
50 years from now,
can they get into school that we all?
Are we able to admit any American students? I mean, are we doing anything in that regard?
Panel?
I do think there are a number of faculty and students who are deeply engaged by the challenges of K through 12 education. We don't have a formal school of education, but we do have an education program, and we do have a number of young people who, through Duke Engage, for example, are working at local schools to try to improve instruction. I think that our faculty probably, and I know this as well here as I do my former institution at Hopkins, individually have lots of outreach efforts to try to engage with schools, but it's not the kind of scaled up assault on this problem that we need. And I think that we're probably not as well positioned on that dimension as some institutions that have schools of education and in urban environments where they're really tackling that head on, which is not to say there aren't lots of individualized efforts going on, but probably not scaled up as a full assault. I will say I know that one of the challenges obviously is financial in the city of Durham to enhance the quality of schools, and the university did throw its weight behind the school bond issue that happened. Bill, when was, I don't remember when that was, but 4 or 5 years ago, to try to help address the investment locally in education. And one of the things that's happened in the face, as everybody in this room knows, in the face of the distressing economic situation the last couple of years, is education is one of the things that gets cut. So the health of that is largely dependent on the health of the economy overall, too.
What would you see, like, I mean, since we have trustee in the room, what would you like to see the university do?
Try to influence on a policy level, national policy, state policy, any type of policy we could, just to elevate education as a priority. And
Yeah. You know, you mentioning the policy issue, it occurs to me that although we don't have a school of education, the Sanford Institute, or Sanford School, excuse me, of Public Policy is in fact turning out lots of folks who care deeply about those sorts of issues.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I've got a comment and a question. I'm in the class of '97. And so, interestingly enough, we had kind of two experiences when we came in '93. We got these wonderful T-shirts celebrating the 30th class with African American students. But at the same time, there was it was either 60 Minutes or 2020 had a news special about how Duke was segregated, and all of the African American students sat in the front of the room so that they could be make themselves distinctive from their peers. I think I was probably the only entering student who had not seen the news special. But there was kind of this cloud of conversation around us of, why would you want to go to a school like that? I'm obviously very, very proud of being a Marine. I've loved it forever. But I do think that sometimes when, with the level of education and prestige and the basketball program and obviously some other less than papery headlines that the school has to deal with, those kinds of things do have an impact on public perception of the school and acceptance. And so I'm curious about your opinion of how that kind of social media and just media coverage of the school, what it does to the population, what it does to kind of the decisions around admissions, how to sculpt that.
I have always been intrigued by the hate Duke syndrome. And I have ideas about it, and I'll just use one example and then try to be more serious. After we won the last basketball championship, and even the commentators were negative, a team that outperformed itself, that reached its potential, that even Coach K was surprised that we had won. And that said to me a lot about what I think about Duke and its possibilities and its outrageous ambition. And so, I was driving through Rock Creek Park, dial up my cell phone, I called Buddy. I said, Buddy, I need some Duke love. I need someone, and we talked and laughed about 5 minutes. And I've never quite understood it, because during the time I was on the board, we would have all of the media and so forth. I think, one, because Duke is a Southern school, we're always suspect. And I think that is Duke's strength, that because in the beginning Duke knew it was Southern, that it had issues, that it couldn't escape them. It has dealt with them in ways that I think are more positive than other institutions. I think there is something also, Duke is a privileged school, and I often tell myself, and I tell other Duke alums, particularly black alums, do not apologize for the opportunity. Use it as your responsibility. Don't be ashamed. Claim Duke for yourself. And work to make it better and to engage in it. And I think we have in our society some ambiguity about excellence and about values and so forth. And I think to have a basketball program where people are scholars and athletes, where we have the chapel, we have so much, so that there are difficulties that I think are created in terms of perception for Duke. And I was here at a time when the head of student government was an African-American woman. I mean, people of various ethnic groups were really performing in leadership roles. And I think it is more newsworthy to talk about issues and problems and to deal with the realities of people kind of working through issues and doing them in a way that is successful and meaningful.
Last question, Mr. Andrews.
Oh,
freshman year. But I've always affiliated myself with Duke. I've always been a Duke. But the comments that you made about once you came through, well, I mean, you said that nobody was going to take away from you what you had gained as your perspective and your right to do what you do. Janet, you were talking about the fact that people in conversation want to hear what you have to say, and you wanted to hear what they had to say. Paula, you were talking about how it exploded your ideas of what you could do. Woody, of course, you mentioned diversity, and we all know that diversity in some institutions, sometimes the military, it's divisive. But at Duke, diversity has been one of the strengths, one of the things that makes us who we are. And this Seeds of Change, I think what you've done is a very good job. And I'd like to ask the one question, the diversity. How has it been, because of the class of '63 and its difference, as opposed to a lot of the other southern schools and things like that, how has it really made us stronger? If anybody has a different comments, because I think it has, and I'd like to hear your comments on it.
Could I make one comment?
Surely.
For the panel, and this comes from a talk that President Broadhead made to the faculty recently that was distributed to the trustees, and I hope he'll distribute it more widely, in which he gave some interesting statistics. And this one really impressed me, that Duke has the largest percentage undergraduate population of African Americans than any of our peer schools in the country, including Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Northwestern, Stanford, you name it. So that's how far we've come in 50 years from where we started. And I think it's right and proper, and it ought to be Duke, because we're the only peer school, we're the only school in that category.
Thank you, Jack. Any panel address, final thoughts? Paula, you about to say something?
I think we had I think the institution felt it had a particular commitment, given that we were in the South, to address especially bringing more African-American students to this institution. And some of you remember some of the scholarship programs that were especially designed, the weekend to bring Black students here. It was a kind of recognition that we had an obligation as well as an opportunity to lead some change in that area. And I think we forget how young Duke is compared to other institutions. And back to your question about the sort of attitude about Duke, which is so often a kind of caricature of a place that isn't the place that most of us who know Duke think it to be. And I think it's partly because we're so young. We've changed dramatically in a very short period of time, from a very local institution with essentially a board that was mostly North and South Carolinians. Not that there's anything wrong with North and South Carolinians.
That's right.
But we broadened our perspective and our expectations. And when I was here early on in administration, there was a kind of love-hate relationship between the city of Durham and Duke. The idea that we might think of ourselves as a national institution was sort of like, don't go getting too big for your britches, Duke, and let alone national, then international. And I think we mediated that over time by people seeing that they could have as a source of pride support for an institution that was having that kind of impact. And I remember Mary Siemens, whom we just lost a month or so ago, a couple months ago. What she always said stuck in my mind about Duke and Durham. She said, in order for the tree to flourish, its roots must be nourished. And I think we did a better job in the last several decades of nourishing our roots. So you ask what's made it strong. I think not apologizing for being in the South and wanting to be of this place, but wanting also to change this place for the better.
I'm going to say one thing, and Randy wants us to move so we can present the big check. And that is this. One of the things that has always struck me about Duke is that Duke has had a streak of revolution and progress throughout its history. We walked around West Campus, the architect was black. We have a founder who in the indenture said, of the 4 schools, 1 is a black school. And when he talks about making sure that there is money for charitable purposes in hospitals, he says, and they have to also be black. He throughout.
He actually said colored.
Colored, well, yeah, colored, colored, yeah, colored school. But, and so the Bassett affair. So there is running through Duke, sometimes unacknowledged, this sense, this newness, this sense of innovation and of change, and a deep moral commitment in terms of James B. Duke. And I think that has been a part of what Duke is and has moved it to where it can be. One of the things that has always struck me, both when I was a trustee and now at the endowment, is that Duke, as it navigated from the local, regional above, has always asked the question, what are the best principles and values of Duke? Not to be the old Duke, but what is best in our heritage, and how do we take that with best practices and move forward? We have moved beyond wanting to be like Harvard. We want to be the best Duke that we can be, and I think that has made a difference in our progress.
And I was just going to say that as we moved from the 63 process when we were trying to go regional to national, you have the same experiences that will take you to world, and you can do it with that history. And that's important since it's been part of our process, although there have been lots of difficulties.
I'm sorry, can I just move on?
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to say, I'm from the class of 92, so it's been really 20 years since I've seen so much of this campus. And there's been probably the most changes. I haven't been everywhere on Science Drive, all that engineering complex and everything that is out there. And it's just a quad and all, they've done so much over there. The one thing that has not changed on Science Drive is that when we graduated, there was, I think, 1 black professor, and I think she was part-time. And now, as far as I understand now, there's still only 1 over there. And so just don't forget about Science Drive.
Okay. Yeah. Absolutely.
Over there, it's a liberal arts college, maybe predominantly, but, we do need that diversity over there as well. And I'm not just talking about foreign students.
Right.
Very good.
Well, Randy's given us a sign. I know we have to break this off. I would urge each of us to go to the President's State of the Union, State of the College, to start, pardon? It's Page Auditorium. So would each of you help me give a hand to this wonderful panel?
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.